On the 3rd of March 1973, a convention known as CITES was adopted to regulate international trade in wildlife. And countries were very eager to adopt this convention and subsequently to join the convention because they were concerned that unregulated trade in wildlife could lead to the extinction of wild plants and animals. Today, there are over 35,000 species of plants and animals that come under the trade controls of CITES. And they basically fall into two clusters we call Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. On Appendix 1, we find species that are already threatened with extinction. And for these species, commercial trade is prohibited. And on the slide, you can see some examples here, the marine turtle, great apes, and tigers. The other cluster is species that are not yet necessarily threatened with extinction, but they could become threatened if their trade is not strictly regulated. And for these species, commercial trade is permitted, subject to meeting 3 conditions required by the Convention. Firstly, the trade must be legal. Secondly, the trade must be sustainable, and there must be a finding called a non-detriment finding done. And thirdly, the trade needs to be reported to the Convention Secretariat, and it is then put into our database for public consumption. There are many species on Appendix 2, or this cluster, in fact 34,000 species, and in this slide you'll see 2 elephants. That's not a mistake. That's because with some species there is what's called a split listing, and you find them both on Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, depending upon their conservation status in the area in which they're found. CITES seeks to avoid overexploitation of wildlife in 2 ways. Where legal trade occurs, it seeks to ensure that it is sustainable, but it also seeks to combat illegal trade. And you'll see from some of the examples I'm going to give today that sometimes legal and illegal trade gets intertwined. Here is a slide that shows just 7 of the many species that can be legally traded under CITES. The most recent is the Hammerhead Shark, which was added to the CITES appendices in 2013 at our last major meeting in Bangkok. There is a great story behind each of the pictures of these 7 species that are in trade, but today I just have an opportunity to highlight 3 of them. Firstly, the African cherry, found here on the African continent, in particular in Cameroon. The bark of the African cherry is very valuable because it has medicinal properties, and it is used, amongst other reasons, for prostate medicine. It is traded from Cameroon and other countries to Europe, to pharmaceutical companies who turn it into various medicinal properties. The bark of the African cherry tree was being harvested in a way that killed the tree. The bark was being over-harvested. And working with the ITTO, we engaged with local forest communities to find another way of harvesting this bark, to find a way of harvesting this bark that did not kill the tree, that would ensure the sustainability of this industry over the long term. And that has been extremely successful. We are now finding that local communities are using new techniques to harvest the bark in a sustainable way. And this is great for the tree, it's great for the forest, fantastic for local communities, but also for the pharmaceutical companies who are importing the bark, because they have a reliable supply of bark over the longer term. The queen conch. The queen conch is a shellfish. It's found across the Caribbean. It's traded for its meat and its shell, primarily for its meat. It's very much sought after in North America. The queen conch was one of the first commercially harvested marine species to be brought under the control of CITES. And what we found is that it was being overexploited through over-harvesting and through illegal trade. And it went through a particular process in CITES known as the Review of Significant Trade. Our Animals Committee reviewed the levels of trade and put in a number of recommendations to put it back on a sustainable footing. Working with the FAO, Regional Fisheries Management Organisations and local fisherfolk, the harvesting of the queen conch is now back on a sustainable footing, which is good for the queen conch, it's good for the local fisher folks, and it's good for those people in North America who like eating the meat. The third example, and Braulio Diaz just referred to this one as well, is the Vicuna. Prior to CITES entering into force in 1975, the Vicuna was hunted to near extinction. There are about 6,000 animals left in the wild. Now, what happened over time is the 5 range states in Latin America got together and decided to do something about this, and they reached a sub-regional agreement about how they would manage the Vicuna and how they would manage trade should trade in the wool be opened up in due course. And countries such as Peru gave their local communities rights to take the animals from the wild, to harvest the wool, and to benefit from the export of that wool. It's a very fine wool. What we see now is that 40 years later, there is trade. The number of Vicuna has gone from 6,000 to close to 400,000 Vicuna in the wild, and local communities are benefiting from the trade in its wool. And in just one village alone in Peru, there are over 900 people who are directly or indirectly employed through the sale of Vicuna wool. It's basically traded to Europe. It's used in high fashion. I'm told a Vicuna suit can cost up to $50,000. I'm not wearing one today. There are, in fact, records in our database of over 15 million trade transactions having been authorised under CITES. And this is growing by about 1 million trade transactions per year. And I think, as you can see from the examples I just gave, these transactions can benefit both people and wildlife if regulated effectively. And while CITES has a conservation objective, it gets embroiled in all sorts of arguments to do with sustainable development, sustainable use, the rights of local and Indigenous peoples, national security, which I'll come to in a while, and also climate change, which was debated in CITES in the context of trade in polar bear. Do we still need CITES? It's been around for 42 years. Has it done its work? Can we move on? Absolutely not. In fact, CITES is needed more today in 2015 than it was in 1973 when it was adopted. When CITES was adopted, world population was in the order of 4 billion people. Today, it's 7.2 billion. That's an additional 3.2 billion potential consumers of wildlife and wildlife products. And here on the African continent, the population is estimated to increase from 1 billion to 2 billion between now and 2050. We've also seen fantastic increase in the middle class, a lot of prosperity generated, a lot of disposable income is available. We have the potential today, through unregulated, unsustainable or illegal trade, to wipe out a species in no time at all. If we add to that the fantastic advances we've made in the transport sector. In 2014, there was 1.1 billion tourist arrivals. There are 100,000 flights taking off every day. And there are over 500 million shipping containers whizzing around the globe every year. And then we're connected via the internet. We can trade with anyone, anytime via the internet. Now, this ability to transport people and cargo is a fantastic advancement, and it can be used for good purposes or it can be used for bad purposes. And what we find is that this legal transport network is also used by the organised criminal gangs involved in the illegal trade to transport their contraband. And the picture you can see in the top corner there, that is a depiction of the illegal trade route of illegally traded elephant ivory. And they put this contraband into shipping containers and they'll carry it through passenger airlines, through the legitimate air and marine transport sector, but they use it for illicit purposes. The illegal wildlife trade is now estimated to be worth up to $20 billion per year, and that excludes marine and timber. We are seeing industrial scale illegal trade in wildlife. It is increasingly driven by transnational organised criminal gangs, in some cases rebel militia, and in other cases by rogue elements of the military. It is a serious crime, and it's being treated as a serious crime alongside other serious crimes, such as trafficking in people, in narcotics, and in arms. This illegal trade is having a particular impact on species found here on the African continent. The African elephant, it is estimated that in the order of 100,000 elephants were slaughtered for their ivory in the course of just 3 years. The rhino, the white rhino. The white rhino, this is a great conservation success story. The recovery of the white rhino from less than 100 to over 20,000 here in South Africa is a great tribute to the efforts of public and private sector here in South Africa to recover this species. But this great conservation success story is now under serious threat. If you look at that graph, back in 2007, there were only 13 rhino poached for their horn. And that was about consistent for the years that preceded that. But all of a sudden, you see an upward trend to the point where in 2014, 1,215 rhino were slaughtered illegally for their horn. If we look here, there's a picture of a small anteater called a pangolin. I was recently in Australia and I talked about the lesser-known pangolin. It was reported in the press as the lesser-known penguin. So I need to check that I pronounce this properly. The lesser-known pangolin, it is a small anteater. It is found in Asia and in Africa, and it is being illegally traded for its scales and for its meat. Now, we can't even count the number of animals that are in illegal trade. We actually go by weight of scales and meat. And in one seizure alone, there were 10 tons of pangolin meat seized. Now, that's the equivalent of 130 people of my weight. So imagine 130 of me across this podium here in one seizure of the pangolin alone. Now, put up a picture of a python here, because python skins are legally traded under CITES from many countries, including Indonesia, Vietnam, and other countries, primarily to Europe, to use in the fashion industry. According to the ITC, this legal trade is worth, at the top end of the value chain, $1 billion per year. But it's also estimated that the illegal trade in python skins is worth $1 billion per year as well. And this is an example of where the illegal trade can completely undermine the sustainability of legal trade and why we need to get this illegal trade under control. It's probably quite obvious that the illegal trade that's going on has a serious consequence in terms of the environment, the particular animals and plants that are being killed, the impact on ecosystems, etc. But this is way beyond an environmental issue. This is a sustainable development issue. And the impacts of illegal trade are multifaceted. Governments lose revenue. Where trade is illegal, there is potential revenue there that is lost. The illegal trade driven by transnational organised criminal gangs, rebel militia, etc., it undermines the rule of law. It corrupts local people and local officials. It is undermining efforts for good governance. And in some regions, such as Central Africa, it is having a security impact, both nationally and regionally. It also robs local people of a resource. It denies local people the opportunity to develop their wildlife resource in the way they would like to develop it, whether for consumptive or non-consumptive purposes. We hear sometimes a debate about responding to illegal wildlife trade. Is it about empowering local communities, or is it about taking a more militaristic response? And sometimes it's presented as an either-or or a competition. I don't look at it that way at all. It is both. We need both responses. But ultimately, it is the local people and the local people's ability to manage their resources that will win the day. But at the moment, we are dealing with organised criminal gangs, heavily armed organised criminal gangs, rebel militia, rogue elements of the military. They will kill a person as fast as they will kill an animal. Local communities are not equipped to deal with a threat of that nature. And as was stated in the 2015 Small Arms Report, you need to achieve a basic level of security to enable local communities to practice certain community-based initiatives. So the reality is we need both. We are confronting heavily armed, organised criminals who are stealing wildlife at an industrial scale. We need to respond to that with force, but at the same time, we are not going to win this over time unless we're actively engaging with, involving, and working with local communities. So it's not either or, it's in fact both. The good news is there is a concerted effort going on globally from the UN right down to a local level. The United Nations in July passed its first dedicated resolution on tackling illicit trafficking in wildlife back in July of this year. We've seen fantastic efforts underway at a regional level. Operation Cobra 3 was the largest cross-regional cooperative effort to tackle illegal wildlife trade ever. It involved 4 continents and 62 countries in combating illegal trade. And we're seeing some fantastic efforts, such as through the Crime Commission. The Crime Congress, held in Doha earlier this year, adopted the Doha Declaration, and the first time you'll see reference there made to combating illicit wildlife trade. We're also seeing the intergovernmental community step up. We saw the creation of the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. It's a consortium of CITES, Interpol, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the World Bank and the World Customs Organization, working together to provide coordinated support at a national and regional level to combat this illegal trade. So there's a lot underway, and that gives us a great sense of hope that we are going to be able to turn the tide on this illegal trade. But colleagues, at the end of the day, the fate of the world's wildlife is in our hands, your hands and my hands. And the future of wildlife is going to be determined by the actions taken by each one of us, both as consumers and as citizens. I thank you.